Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Resilient Health Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Darin Ingels, and my guest today is Dr. Betty Murray. Dr. Murray is a PhD, recent PhD, as I understand, in integrative and functional nutrition. You also have a master's in nutrition. You work as a clinical nutritionist, but you're also a certified functional medicine practitioner and an expert on menopause and hormones, which is going to be our topic today. So, Dr. Betty, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Ingels. I'm excited to be here and share my knowledge.
Well, hey, let's dive right in, for, women who are getting to that stage of their life, where they're perimenopausal or might be full menopausal. Look, men go through this too. We all go through our hormonal changes, but it just seems to be, it's a little bit more profound, I think, for women than for a lot of men anyway. And with that comes a lot of changes in your hormones, a lot of changes in your metabolism. Maybe we can start off and just talk a little bit about, what are some of these big hormonal changes that are happening, and ultimately kind of, how does that affect metabolism?
Right, right. So I think, a lot of things is as a community and as a society, we've done a really poor job of educating women about their bodies and particularly this transition. So to qualify it, menopause is a single day in our life, which is one day. That's a full 365 days from the last time we had our period. However, the average woman spends 8 years in a hormonal time period called perimenopause, where we're highly symptomatic, and there's a lot of things that are changing. So the stats are 87% of women are highly symptomatic for up to an average of 8 years. So that means some of us are lovely outliers that are on the other side of the bell curve, closer to 16, right? And some women sail through it with less obvious symptoms. Um, what's even more important is it's not just about controlling hot flashes and night sweats. That's how it gets portrayed. Oh, women just need to worry about it because those pesky night sweats and the hot flashes. But what really is occurring for women is, number one, all cause mortality goes up. So everything we could die from: heart disease, heart attack, stroke, breast cancer, colon cancer, lung cancer, deep vein thrombosis, congestive heart failure, all these really horrible things, osteoporosis and falling, and then leading to frailty and nursing homes, all increase at dramatic rates once we lose our hormones. And so replacing hormones is more than just covering up symptoms. It's actually reducing the likelihood of early mortality and poorer health in a longer lifespan. And also on the other side of that is every single cell in our body has receptors for estrogen except for two: our red blood cells and a single cell in the brain. So that means every single cell, every tissue, every part of the body feels it when that hormone is declining. And it impacts the body significantly, and especially how our powerhouses inside our cells work, how our body mobilizes and utilizes fat, our insulin sensitivity. And so I feel like women are at this point now where we're finally frustrated. I mean, I'm 54, going on 55. I started that journey in my late 30s. I was in functional medicine and I didn't even really realize that that's truly what was happening. I thought it was thyroid and this other stuff. And so I think we just don't understand that the impact is much, much greater than just the symptoms.
So, with these hormonal changes, we often hear, at least I hear in my clinical practice, my metabolism's changing, I'm gaining weight, I feel more puffy. Aside from all the typical symptoms we tend to associate with menopause, there seems to be a shift in metabolism. How do we help guide women through that process? Because look, this is something Mother Nature does. Like, your hormones at some point, when your egg reserve is gone, the hormone levels are going to drop. So how do we help keep women's metabolism on point when these hormone levels are changing? Is it really just a function of, look, we need to replace these hormones? Or are there other things that we need to do in start of shifting people's diet? Are there other kind of factors that we can influence?
Yeah, I think of it as really four main pillars. Obviously, I'm a fan of replacing hormones in women, but I think that's an individualized conversation with your provider. But I do think most women are candidates. But really, those four pillars are driven by what's really happening. So when estrogen declines, the first thing that happens is we start to see changes in how our body deposits fat. So when we are fertile and everything, all the hormones are balanced, we deposit more fat subcutaneously. So that means that what I call the jiggly bits, the stuff we don't like, but it's the stuff on the outside of the muscle, on the hips, the thighs, the lower abdomen. But as we start to lose estrogen, that fat distribution starts to change to visceral fat, which is the fat underneath the muscle in the abdomen around the organs. And it's that fat is very, very inflammatory. It drives, inflammatory cytokines, which nobody knew what that was until a couple of years ago. And then it increases insulin resistance. So we get fat deposit changes. Like women will say, oh my gosh, it really feels like my butt has creeped around to the front. And I'm like, it has. It's because the body has shifted where fat storage goes. And the interesting thing is the research shows this is exercise and caloric restriction does not change that in peri and postmenopausal women. So just counting calories and just trying to exercise more won't get rid of it. The other thing that happens is in our cells, we have a powerhouse, and that powerhouse needs to run at full steam. Well, estrogen affects how many powerhouses get built. So as your body builds the next cell, it needs to build more powerhouses. It reduces that. It's called mitochondrial biogenesis. So the powerhouses get built less. We burn less fuel. We have less energy. And so we start to lose muscle mass. And those two things and the impending insulin resistance makes it harder for us to do the things that used to work before, right? Just cut back calories and exercise more. So we have to address the mitochondrial problems, the powerhouse, and we have to address, the fat distribution. And I look at that, and I'm a nutrition professional, and I go, okay, what can I do to fix that? That's obviously not hormone replacement. I have people in my clinic that do that, but we can change how we exercise and how we actually burn fuel to teach our body to be more efficient. And we can also make sure that we're eating a diet that helps enforce good metabolic health. So we're less likely to see that weight gain, because the average woman gains 10 to 15% of their body mass, right? So if you're 150 pounds, that's 15 to like 20, 2.5 pounds just by going through menopause, doing nothing differently, which means we can't do what we were doing before. And then I think, the other pillar is protecting the things that drive our stress chemistry. So stress, when we're under a lot of stress, we produce cortisol, and that wreaks havoc on the sex hormones like estrogen. And so we have to protect the things like sleep and recovery and how we perceive our life and learning to say no and the lifestyle pieces that are so very important. So when we're hitting all of those cylinders, right, the diet, the exercise, the stress response, and controlling for that, and then in many cases, maybe replacing the hormones as I'm going through that transition, I can keep that from happening, but I can also improve my health over that time period.
So when we're talking about exercise, like you said, this idea of we just need to exercise more, eat less calories. I mean, I think as a general rule, we found in terms of maintaining weight loss, improving muscle mass, that's never been a great strategy. And we've kind of proven that over and over. Should women be thinking more about weightlifting, that kind of resistance training? Is that going to be the kind of thing that's going to really help improve their fat mass to muscle mass ratio?
Absolutely. So as a woman, again, because we're losing all these hormones, we lose about 1% each year or so of our muscle mass, just if we're not working really hard to put it back on. So the focus should absolutely be weight training. And it doesn't have to be hours of weight training. It just needs to be weight training that is effective, meaning that you are working those muscles until they actually get to a point where there's stimulus to muscle growth. So what I tell women is we have to lift heavy stuff, right? And we need to do it repeatedly. And we want to do it with big muscle groups. So, because I meet a lot of women and they're like, oh, Betty, I use my 5-pound arm weights. And I'm like, okay, those are vanity muscles. Those are great because they look good in, sleeveless shirts, but we want to move the big muscle groups. You want to squat, you want to deadlift, you want to bench press. You need to do these big things where you get your butt, your legs, and your quads and your upper body involved. It also helps you build muscle mass and bone mass, which is so very important. And on the other flip side of that, adding more just general movement, walking, but that doesn't mean running, and a lot of intense, stress chemistry raising sort of exercise. So moving more, but it doesn't necessarily mean an intensity. And then using high intensity intervals, but at short interval lengths. So not 45 minutes. I'm sorry, I rip on this company every day, but I can't help it. Like Orange Theory, right? Orange Theory does a great job of marketing, but they're marketing to the wrong group. In women in their 40s and above, most of the time, that is way too much stress producing, cortisol producing exercise, and it is counterproductive for a lot of women, but shorter duration, intense, and then stop.
Yeah, I always think about, and of course, the Olympics are on now, and I'm like glued to the TV watching like the sprinters. And it's interesting when you look at the body type of a sprinter versus the body type of the marathon runners, the long distance, they've got so much more bulk, so much more muscle mass because, again, it's sprint, rest, sprint, rest. Their training regimen's very different than someone who's doing distance running. And I think the concept's kind of the same, is that we need to do some pretty high intensity exercise, or like I said, maybe some heavy lifting, short burst, rest, give that muscle a chance to recover and build. And again, we're not looking to make you, a huge bodybuilder, but just enough to stress that muscle that it starts to repair itself, grow, and get, more lean muscle mass.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I think, thank God we've got the Olympics to really like bring that home. Like, who wouldn't want to have the body of a sprinter, right? It's true though. It's very true. And that's how we have to sort of think about it and change what we're doing.
There's a hormone that I'm pretty sure no one's ever heard of, and I know you've talked about it in other interviews, this thing called adiponectin, that is sort of a key hormone. Can you explain a little bit about what it is and why it's important for us?
Yeah, so adiponectin is the fat mobilization hormone. So it is the hormone that reaches into your fat cells, mobilizes it, and dumps it into the bloodstream. And then another hormone called epinephrine, which is part of your fight or flight, picks it up and delivers it to the cell. And then so adiponectin can have some genetic variability. So some people are really good at producing adiponectin. Some people are not very good at producing it. And we can also become resistant to it. As a matter of fact, when we become more insulin resistant, where we're not mobilizing glucose properly and transporting it properly to the muscle and it's going to the fat cell instead, what happens is we often become insulin resistant and adiponectin resistant at the same time. So the body can't burn sugar very well and can't get the fat out of the fat cell very well either. And that's part of the insidious part of kind of type 2 diabetes and pre-diabetes insulin resistance.
So, for women who might be considering using hormones, maybe just a brief explanation about, if you go to your conventional OBGYN, they're going to have one philosophy. If you're working with an integrated practitioner, we're going to have a different philosophy. Maybe just a little understanding of what the differences are between the two.
Right, right. So definitely conventional medicine. So I'm sure you've talked about this, but up until 2002, hormone replacement was standard of care for all women since the 40s, right? So our ancestors, my grandmother and, a couple generations back, so 20 years ago, women were all put on hormones as they went through menopause and often for a fairly long period of time with no real hoopla. Well, the Women's Health Initiative started as one of the most expensive and largest studies ever conducted. The group that was putting the study together had a subset of individuals that really felt that they needed to prove that hormones were unsafe for whatever reason. That was their bias. And as somebody who does research, bias is a problem. You have to really check yourself to make sure you're not implying your own bias on your own research. But so as that study progressed, they ended the study in 2001 and then 2002 because they found some early risk factors for stroke risk in the group, in one group. And it was the group that was taking a oral estrogen called Premarin and a synthetic progestin called it was called Prempro was the actual drug. And the synthetic progestins increase our risk for blood clots. And it does that in everybody, right? To some degree, there's some increased risk. And so they halted the study. And, basically, before it ever went through peer review, which is how studies get proved, that like they check and balance it to make sure that what was said is really true. Before it ever went through peer review, it got released to the media. And the media went nuts with it. And part of what they also promoted in their sort of statistical analysis, and I can tell you, I can lie with statistics like nobody's business, because you can just change how you word something and you can make it sound really bad. One of the stats that they put in that press release was that there was a 25% increased risk of breast cancer in the women who were taking this drug. Well, but it wasn't statistically significant, but of course that was, of course, left off the media, right?
Right.
So what it really was is it went from everybody has a risk. So all women at menopause and beyond have a 4 in 1,000 risk for having breast cancer. That study showed that it went to a 5 in 1,000 risk, which is not statistically significant. The hazard ratio is not valuable. It was zero concern, but everybody went nuts, and literally hormones were no longer given at that point. So most of your conventional doctors have not paid attention. That study has been retracted. It actually got re-statistically analyzed this year and published, and they showed at 8 years, 18 years, and now that all the things they said that were dangerous aren't true. And so you've got a lot of conventional doctors that are still stuck on that dogma. Or they think, oh, you can only give a little bit for the shortest period of time, only to cover up your symptoms and just enough. When we're trying to prevent poor lifespan and early disease death. I think one of the most important studies anybody that's listening today needs to look at and read. It was a study that was published in May of this year in Menopause Journal. And it was a 10 million study, 10 million women, looking at the safety of hormone replacement therapy in women 65 and above. And so they looked at mortality data from 2007 to 2022 for everything: stroke, heart attack, lung cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer, the whole shebang. And what they found across the board, now all the stats were slightly different, but across the board, the women that were on hormone replacement and never stopped had a lower risk mortality in pretty much everything, including breast cancer, lung cancer, colon cancer. And when they compared the group that did hormone replacement orally to a topical preparation of estrogen, like a patch or something else, and a non-oral progesterone, or a non-oral progestin or a progesterone or an IUD, any risk with estrogen was mitigated. So no risk for blood clots, all of that was gone. Now, have we seen that get plastered everywhere? No. But an integrative practitioner is going to understand the more recent research. They're going to understand that if that hormones are protective to our body, and they're going to take a more natural approach, and they're going to apply bioidentical hormones, which are identical to the hormones that you make, and work with you and also test. I think it's important to test and make sure you've got enough, the right amount, and that you know how to kind of get your hormones wrapped up and ready for the trash, and you get rid of them when you're done. And so I think people need to know that, and that if they talk to a practitioner and that practitioner shames them or won't talk to them about it or acts like they're going to withhold it from them, or I'll give it to you this year, but you won't have any more next year, fire them. Just peace out. It's time to move on. They are not worth keeping. It's very, very frustrating. The statistics are 73% of women still can't get treatment.
Wow. That's shocking.
Let's go through it. 100% go through it.
Well, what about the concern for women who maybe have a strong family history of breast cancer, uterine cancer, ovarian cancer, whether they've personally had those issues? What's the advice for those women who have that concern about, hey, my doctor said that this could be dangerous. My mom had breast cancer, my grandmother had breast cancer. Isn't this going to be a problem?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some, particularly familial cancer risks like Lynch syndrome, which runs in a family, and it's an overall risk for cancers, many different cancers, or like BRCA carriers have increased risks. What's interesting is particularly that 10 million women study didn't really show increased risk, including in women who had breast cancer history. Right. So, and so I think I look at it, I'm not a prescriber, but I run a very large clinic and telemedicine company that do prescribe. I think it's a conversation that's individualized to every single patient. Everybody's got a different health history, a different life, a different experience, and we have to kind of look at it that way. But I don't think a breast cancer or a cancer history is 100% no.
And what about, sorry, go ahead.
There's a really good book. It's written by Avram Blooming called Estrogen Matters. anybody that's super concerned about this and wants to understand what the research really says, that's what this book is. It's literally written by a breast cancer oncologist. He's a 40-year history, brilliant man, brilliant researcher. I like, to me, it's an absolute need to read for every female.
Well, for women who've actually had a history of breast cancer, uterine cancer, ovarian cancer, who struggle horribly through menopause, I know as a practitioner, it's a huge struggle with that history, but they're struggling so much. What's your advice to those women?
Yeah, I think it warrants, if you're still struggling with symptoms, right? And it's a quality of life conversation, and it's, is there truly a risk there or not? Because we have more tools today than we had 20 years ago to stratify risk. I think it's really important to find a practitioner that will have that conversation, that will explore whether that's right for you. There are things like vaginal estrogen cream that can help with some of the genital urinary symptoms that kind of come with it. There are, ways to address certain particular areas that aren't necessarily systemic hormones. But we have patients that are previous cancer patients that are thriving on hormones.
Well, it always kind of made sense to me, this idea that hormones cause cancer, I don't think is true at all. I mean, if that was the case, we would have, 19, 20, 25-year-old women, bursting with these reproductive cancers. And that's not the population we typically see. And, when we hear about even like breast cancer that's estrogen, progesterone receptor positive, I'm like, well, of course they have receptors. That's why, women get breast tenderness when they're premenstrual. I mean, it's the effect of the hormone. So the expression of these receptors is not abnormal.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I guess as a practitioner, I've always kind of struggled too. I'm like, well, wait a second. I'm like, we actually don't really have evidence that hormones cause cancer, certainly. And for women, again, who've had a history of cancer, again, who are really struggling with menopausal symptoms, and their OBGYN saying, absolutely not, this is dangerous, it's going to make your cancer worse, or the cancer is going to come back. Again, I'm not an expert in this field at all, but I'm not aware of any evidence that that's true. I think correct me if I'm wrong, is this really just sort of a theoretical risk that they're explaining concern over?
Yeah, actually, there's studies, and there's lots of different breast cancer types, right? Different cell types. But there's, true studies showing in some types of cancer cells, breast cancer cells with estrogen receptor positive, that if you introduce bioidentical estrogen, the cells die, right? So, so it's not, it's not what it is because we express those hormones on those tissues, because again, every tissue has it, those cells are still operating to some degree with those receptors, but they also have abnormal growth. And so the drug companies used that as a target in order to develop chemotherapy drugs. That is not, it's not causative, it happens to be correlative. The most aggressive breast cancer is triple negative. It's because it's a cancer cell that no longer expresses any of its normal function,
Right.
And it's not estrogen, progesterone, or HER2 positive. So I think, I always, I'm a scientist first and foremost, and I'm a logical person, and I'm always like, science is always logical. And I was like, if it doesn't sound logical, it's not right, and so it never balanced for me either, Aaron, at all.
Yeah, well, I know it can be very complicated. Like you said, everyone's different. You have to just meet people where they're at, what your comfort level is. And but I think it's an important conversation that you have with your practitioner, again, particularly if you've been struggling with these perimenopause and menopausal symptoms. Because again, in our practice, we see people who are just absolutely debilitated once they go through the change. And I'm always kind of gobsmacked at the number of practitioners that kind of refuse to treat these women. And it just biologically never made a lot of sense to me.
No, I would agree. And the other thing is, I was talking to one of my patients last week, and she was like, Betty, it's also about a quality of life. Like, what's the use of having a life if it's not quality? And she's like, I'm not willing to give up feeling good, because most of us get to this time period of life. You and I are probably the same age. Like, kids are probably out of the house. We finally have a moment. Who wants to feel like crap for the next 30 years? Right? Because the truth is, it's unprecedented. We don't, in 1900, our average lifespan was 57 years. Our menopause hasn't caught up to our longevity. So we have, a good third of our life spent without hormones. And so that's why we're at this juncture.
I always have this thought, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Menopause is a natural part of a woman's life. This is what's supposed to happen. Egg reserve diminishes, estrogen progesterone levels drop. That is normal. So if that is a normal phase of life, why are we in a position where so many women do need that hormone replacement? It seems that this is something Mother Nature designed for a reason, where women destined to die earlier because they didn't have these hormones? Or is
Yes.
it really because of all the environmental and lifestyle things that are in our current society that cause all these issues? What do you think about all that?
I mean, I think, we're mammals and there's only, two mammals that live significantly after reproduction, us and whales. And there's a lot of like, anthropological sort of ideas on why that is. Maybe it's because our kids take way longer to, to get them out of the nest kind of thing. So I look at it and yes, it is a natural thing, but it is in our history unnatural for us to live as long as we are. Right. And it's because we have sanitation and all those other things that have added to our lifespan. And, maybe we flash forward 100,000 years from now and we go through menopause at 75. Who knows? So it's unprecedented. But here's the thing that bothers me the most. If your thyroid stops working, we replace the hormone. If you have a growth hormone deficiency, we replace the hormone. If you have an insulin deficiency, we replace the hormone. If you have a testosterone deficiency as a man, no one questions replacing the hormone. When men go through andropause, except you have a slow roll where we cliff dive one day, right? So yours is less noticeable and not as profound. But it is only in women's health that we tell women you shouldn't ask for that. How dare you go against Mother Nature? Right. And I'm like, it is a hormone deficiency, and we just happen to live a lot longer past that. If it were only symptom suppression, I might look at it and go, oh, is it really important to replace the hormones? Right. Hot flashes, night sweats, vaginal, dryness, whatever, low libido. If it's just that, maybe we would look at it. But the reality is women have a longer lifespan, poorer health span. So we live longer than men, but we're more likely to be frail, nursing home bound, and ill. And it is literally because of those hormones. That's what drives my drive. I'm like, I don't want to be living in a nursing home at 90 and have been there for 15 years because I was frail, right? And so that's what I look at, and I'm like, it is natural, but I think it is something that's unprecedented. And yes, we have toxins in our environment and other stuff that is probably making it way worse, way worse.
Well, point very well taken. Well, I know that you have a free hormone quiz available on your website, and we'll post that link in the show notes for people that want to kind of walk through that with you and kind of have a better understanding about kind of where they're at. But I'm really glad that you were able to spend some time with us to put out this really important information, because again, there's just, I mean, literally millions and millions of women, not just in the US, but around the world, struggling with this issue, trying to get help. So like you said, if you've got someone who's not playing ball, don't be shy, and, go find someone who can help you navigate this, because it is tricky, and finding the right balance of hormones, because often we're not just dealing with estrogen and progesterone, we're dealing with cortisol issues and even testosterone and insulin. And it's a beautiful dance, but we have to figure out, when those hormone levels drop, what the right balance is for you. So I just encourage anyone who's listening to, get the help, seek out a provider, a functional medicine provider like yourself, who can help navigate these waters.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you so much, Betty.